I am. It's a hazard. My name is Paula Davis, and I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity for the School of Mental Sciences. I wanted to thank you for joining us today for our Diversity in Practice speaker series. And our speaker today is Dr. Chales Reynolds, who I've had the pleasure to know and to work with for almost 20 years. This is really marching on very quickly. And if you don't know, Dr. Reynolds is internationally renowned in the field of geriatric psychiatry. He's the endowed professor in geriatric psychiatry here in the School of Medicine, but is also a professor of behavioral community health services in the Graduate School of Public Health. He directs the Aging Institute at UPMC and Pitt, and the National Institute of Mental Health sponsored Center for Excellence in the Prevention and Treatment of Late Life Mood Disorders. Dr. Reynolds also directs the John A. Hartford Center of Excellence in Geriatric Psychiatry and chairs the Sleep-Wake Disorders Work Group for the DSM-5 at the American Psychiatric Association. His primary research interests focus on mood, grief, and sleep disorders of later life, with a particular focus on mental health services in primary care, improving treatment strategies, and depression prevention. Dr. Reynolds' bibliography contains over 620 publications in peer-reviewed journals, and that's actually a pretty frightening figure there to check. That's one problem if anybody else is going to get there, which he has written over the past 31 years. He's the associate editor of the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry and has also served on the editorial board of the American Journal of Psychiatry and the Archives of General Psychiatry. He's published his works in JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and Lancet. I give to you this afternoon Dr. Chales Reynolds.
Mario, are we good to go?
Good to go. Very safe.
And Mario, our time now, we need to finish a little before 1 today, right?
Exactly. So we're working with about 45 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So folks, thank you very much for coming today. Good to see a number of colleagues and friends of long standing whom I've had the pleasure to work for many years indeed. Can you hear me okay in the back? Is that working?
No.
Not working well?
Mike's no one.
Not sure everyone's here yet.
What?
Testing. I don't think the audio is working, is it? Is that any better? No. I'll try speaking up. How's that? Is that okay? All right. Well, most of my talk today is going to focus on scientific issues related to preventing depression in older African Americans. I thought I would set the stage by sharing a few personal perspectives with you and how I came to be interested in this topic over a long period of time. I am the scion of a Mississippi farming family. For the better part of a century, my dad's family were cotton farmers in the Mississippi Delta. And some of you may know that much of the 20th century, and particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, the Mississippi Delta was a hotbed of both violent racism, but also of profound social change in our country. And having spent a lot of time on my grandparents' farm in the Mississippi Delta, I had a first-hand account of what life was like for black people living in a part of the country that was virulently and violently racist. And I also saw the changes that unfolded with immense pain in that part of the South. I think that a lot of that has left an indelible impression on me, and it certainly imprinted itself on the social and political views that I carried for much of my life. I came of age in the 1960s, And there are several dates in the 1960s that are just indelibly imprinted on my memory. August the 28th, 1963, I Have a Dream. April the 4th, 1968. I may not get there with you, but I have seen the Promised Land. One of the heroes of my youth was murdered on that terrible day in Memphis, Martin Luther King. If you've not made a pilgrimage to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where now stands the nation's Civil Rights Museum, I hope that you will make that pilgrimage. It is deeply moving and well worth the effort involved to get to Memphis. June the 5th, 1968, the day that, again, one of my heroes, Senator Kennedy, was murdered after winning the California primary in his pursuit of the Democrat nomination. And as if that weren't enough, you know what happened, don't you, in November of 1968? You know what happened then, right? The nation in its infinite wisdom saw fit to elect a man who would become best known for being someone trying to tear up the Constitution, right? And thanks to the moral courage of people like Barbara Jordan, a marvelous black congresswoman from Texas, her moral suasion eventually prevailed, and the nation was able to get rid of this man. So it was a horrible year, but I'm making the point that these events really imprinted themselves indelibly on my formation as a young man, and I think have influenced some of the choices that I've made professionally in my commitment to mental health issues in underserved people. As a medical student at Yale, I spent some additional time in two other places that I think deeply impressed me. One, when I was visiting my grandparents' farm, I visited what was then the Tufts Mount Bayou Health Center. I don't think we had federally qualified health centers at that point, but I think that the Tufts Mount Bayou Health Center was probably a good precursor of what came to be known as federally qualified health centers, with its work with poor black people living in the Mississippi Delta. The other thing that I did as a medical student, one of my buddies in medical school was a guy named Mika Omieri Mitoko. And Mika was a Lua tribesman who had grown up on the shores of Lake Victoria in Kenya and found his way to Yale Medical School. A marvelous story in its own right. He and I befriended each other, and I decided that I would go home with him and spend some time in East Africa, in Kenya. So part of the time I spent in the Kenyatta National Hospital in Nairobi, but other parts of the time I journeyed to Mika's village on the shores of Lake Victoria. And I think that experience, that spending some time with the WHO researchers who were surveying issues of malnutrition, kwashiorkor, beriberi, also infectious diseases like Hansen's disease and tuberculosis, infected me, so to speak, with a great interest in public health. So a number of these experiences, I think, came together, and I think I've carried them forward in some ways. I've become an academic physician and a psychiatrist. So thank you for letting me share those experiences with you. I think will give you some sense of why I've come to feel as passionately as I do about the scientific issues that we are pursuing. I'd like now to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in depression prevention, and a project that we recently completed that focused specifically on depression prevention in older African Americans. Before doing that, though, I'd like to say thank you to a number of people who are here. This is a project that was sponsored primarily by the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities through a P60 Center grant to Stephen Thomas, who at that point, 2007, was head of the Center for Minority Health at the Graduate School of Public Health. We benefited greatly in the formulation and conduct of the study from conversations with the Community Research Advisory Board, which was chaired by my colleague and friend Jeanette Southball. And that was immensely helpful to us. We also had help from the CTSI, the Community Engagement Core of the Clinical Translational Science Institute. I want to acknowledge that, as well as support from the National Institute of Mental Health. My close collaborators in the project were several other colleagues in the Graduate School of Public Health, notably Stephen Thomas, Sandra Krause-Quinn, Stephen Albert, Stuart Anderson, who's here today, and Ed Ritchie, who played a marvelously helpful and catalytic role in getting the work going. So my thanks to all of these colleagues and friends. Well, why is this an important topic? Why is the focus on prevention of depression a worthwhile and important topic? Basically, although our treatments for depression are actually quite good, they are still limited with respect to their ability to avert years lived with disability. The World Health Organization has reckoned unipolar depression to be among the topmost contributors to the global burden of illness-related disability, a fact that is increasing in time, both in high-income countries and in low and middle-income countries as well. So the emphasis then on prevention has to do with the fact that our treatments, while good, are far more circumscribed in their impact than we would care to have with respect to the issues of disability. As well, there are many barriers to accessing appropriate treatment for depression, particularly among underserved peoples. Some of these barriers have to do with stigmas that are felt internally, but stigma that also exist externally in the communities of underserved people. These are also important issues that impede access to and retention in appropriate treatments for depressive illness. I'd like to say also, again by way of a personal note, if I may, that while I was still a physician in training, I was serving my psychiatry residency here at WPIC, and Lauren Roth, who's in the audience today, was one of my attendings and teachers at that point. My grandfather, then 90, the guy who owned the Reynolds plantation down there in the Mississippi Delta, suffered a post-stroke depression. And Mr. Charlie, as he was called by family and by friends, chose to end his life. He shot himself, ending his life in suicide. As I say, I was a psychiatry resident at that point, already interested in old age psychiatry, but that got my attention, and it really helped, I think, to focus my energy and interest on the issues of depression and suicide prevention in old age. So we talked a little bit about then why the prevention of depression is an important thing to do, and we've also addressed the issue of why it's important to focus particularly on underserved people. The other point that we'd like to talk about, I think in this context, is that preventing depression is also a way of promoting resilience in old age to the multiple slings and arrows that older adults have to live to. And we've taken to heart the notion that, in fact, what is good for the heart, as you'll see in a moment, is also good for the brain. Preventing depression is good for heart health, it's also good for brain health, and it helps people to continue to be able to age independently for as long as possible. This notion of aging independently is a critical one in the work that we do, because depression is one of the greatest threats to an older person's ability to live independently. We've also learned that depression is a risk factor for a number of other issues in the lives of older people. It undermines adherence with co-prescribed medical regimens, for example. It also increases the risk for dementia. So it may well be that if we can prevent depression, or if we can treat it adequately in an older person, we may be modifying risk factors for bad things that happen downstream. This is of particular relevance to Black older adults who live with a great burden of cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and in whom the incidence of dementia appears to be greater than in white people. So again, depression figures in all of these issues, and by intervening to prevent depression or to treat it in older adults, as the case may be, we may be having many downstream beneficial consequences, both to the person himself, herself, but also to family caregivers. Now, having sort of set the stage here, let me talk briefly about the burden of risk factors for depression, particularly in older Black adults. In our work, when we examined the risk architecture for depression in older adults and compared that across the Black and white participants in the clinical trial that I'm going to describe for you momentarily, we found that there was a substantially greater burden of medical and social risk factors for depression among the Black participants in our trial. You will not be surprised to hear about the greater burden, for example, of hypertension, or diabetes mellitus, or obesity among our Black participants, a very substantial proportion of whom had body mass indices north of 30. Issues of social isolation were also important. Issues of social challenge, grandparents parenting grandkids, folks living in dangerous neighborhoods and feeling chronically stressed, wondering how they would make ends meet. All of these constituted ongoing stressors in the lives of our participants and were much more prevalent in the lives of our Black participants than in those of our white participants. On the other hand, this is an important counter consideration, we saw a more robust, positive problem-solving orientation among the Black participants than we did among the white participants. A greater sense of, I can somehow do this, I can somehow cope. The other point here that I think has been noted in the epidemiology of depression and suicide amongst the nation's elderly is that, you may be interested to know this, the lowest rates of completed suicide among the nation's elderly, the lowest rates are in older Black women. That's a remarkable finding, and it contrasts greatly with the elevated suicide rates among older white men, like my grandfather. A remarkable difference. Okay, so that sets the stage for the clinical trial that we decided to embark on. We were particularly interested in examining not only the relative risk architecture for depression among Black and white older participants, we were also interested in examining whether there would be race-related differences in the way people responded to interventions to prevent depression. This was sort of the foundational theme of the study that we conducted. Our study focused on what the Institute of Medicine calls indicated prevention. That is to say, prevention that addresses people who are living already with mild symptoms of depression and who are therefore at risk for progression of illness to fully syndromal major depression. A number of epidemiologic studies have shown that it is probably most efficient and cost-effective to focus on folks who are already mildly symptomatic in terms of prevention, rather than trying to do other types of prevention in the current state of the art. The other two types of prevention that have been specified by the Institute of Medicine, in addition to indicated prevention, are first selective prevention, which is directed at people with known risk factors. Let's suppose you've had a stroke, as my grandfather did. That puts you at substantial risk for developing a depression sometime in the 3 to 6 months after you had a stroke. this is something that Beth Skidmore in the audience today is currently working on. That's an example of selective prevention. Not necessarily folks who are already living with symptoms, but rather folks who have, for example, a medical or neurological condition that puts them at risk for depression. And then the other type of prevention, so-called universal prevention, as formulated by the Institute of Medicine, is directed at everyone in the general population and might, for example, include education of the general population of kids, adults, in healthy lifestyle choices to promote heart health, to promote brain health and cognitive fitness would be examples of that. And again, from a public health perspective, indicated prevention is thought to be the most efficient and is the reason that we chose to focus the clinical trial prevention of depression in older African Americans in terms of indicated prevention. What do we know from the literature about this? Again, a little bit more of a background, and then I'll present the key findings and outcomes of our study. Well, a recent meta-analysis and systematic review from our colleague Pim Kuipers, who is professor of psychology and head of the Department of Clinical Psychology at the Free University in Amsterdam. Pim is one of the world's leaders in depression prevention research and is an advisor to our Center of Excellence here in Pittsburgh. Pim was able to identify some 38 studies, controlled clinical trials, of varying quality, focused on depression prevention in the literature, most of which dealt with kids, adolescents, younger adults, and none of which paid any particular attention to the issues of underserved peoples. Most of these studies involved structured interventions such as learning-based psychotherapies, such as cognitive behavior therapy. The overall finding was expressed in terms of incident rate reduction, that participants in these clinical trials, randomized to the experimental arms of the trial, experienced on average a 20% reduction in the incidence of episodes of major depression, typically over a one-year period. Most of the trials are relatively short, typically over about 1 year. So that's kind of the background here. Now, what I'll do is focus on the trial that we conducted here at the University of Pittsburgh. This was a conjoint effort of colleagues in the Graduate School of Public Health, in the Department of Psychiatry, and the School of Medicine, and also involved considerable input, as I mentioned, from the Community Research Advisory Board, as well as support from Pitt's CTSI. It's always important, my mom said, to say thank you. We have many people to say thank you here. So we recruited 247 participants into this clinical trial, ages 50 and older. About 38% of these participants, 90, were African American. 38% is about 3 times the average rate of African American participation in the clinical trials that I've conducted with NIH support over the last 3 decades. So our target had been 50%, we got to 38%. We were very pleased with that because with an N of 90 participants, we were able to conduct meaningful analyses of the similarities and differences in the risk architecture for depression amongst the Black and white participants, but also to examine patterns of response to the interventions that were a part of our trial. Let me comment on how folks came into the trial, because this was one of, for me, the most challenging and I think interesting parts of the study. My colleague Jackie Stack is here in the audience today. Jackie was the clinical administrator for our center and was intimately involved, thank you Jackie, in all aspects of the study, and particularly in the hard work of recruitment. But I would say that in terms of recruiting Black participants, we found it particularly helpful to have partners in the Black communities of Pittsburgh, most notably Maddie Woods. executive director and a Petra minister in the Wilkinsburg-located Center for Healthy Hearts and Souls. My colleague Ed Ritchie in the Graduate School of Public Health had introduced Jackie and me to Maddie. Maddie became a champion for our study and was immensely helpful in the recruitment of Black participants into the clinical trial. In essence, her imprimatur, these are good guys, was vitally important in our ability to recruit. Our colleagues on the Community Research Advisory Board at GSPH were also very helpful, and in particular, our partnerships with the Kingsley Center and the Healthy Black Family Project in East Liberty was also an important source of recruitment for Black participants. Our colleagues in the CTSI Community Engagement Corps also contributed to what was a very challenging effort. For the most part, we assessed and evaluated and treated our Black participants close to the places that they call home. For example, we saw many of them at the Kingsley Center. We saw others in churches and in places that meant that they did not have to travel to our research clinic in Oakland. Our ability to connect with people in the community, I think, was very important in the high rate of retention, not only recruitment, but also retention that we were able to demonstrate in the study. There was no differential loss from the study of Black and white participants. Somewhere close to 85% of people were able to complete the trial, which is a remarkable figure in its own right. Many of our white participants, by contrast, tended to come from primary care clinics. We've had a network of primary care clinics for many years. Much of our research in the treatment of depression has occurred in the general medical sector rather than necessarily in the specialty mental health sector. So the network of primary care practices, particularly with the champion of that by Fran Solano, were very helpful to us in recruiting white participants into the trial. Okay, one of the key decisions that we faced in the conduct of the trial was how to intervene in a way that might prevent depression in vulnerable older adults. Recall now that we are recruiting people who are already mildly symptomatic with depression, and we can expect that 20 to 25% of them will progress to major depression over 1 to 2 years without some kind of intervention. That's the background, and it's important for you to understand that. So after a good deal of consideration, we thought that we chose 2 interventions that we wanted to test. One, problem-solving therapy, PST, for primary care. It's been shown to be a robust treatment for depression in primary care settings. But by focusing, as it does, on active coping styles, and by an effort to increase the resilience of people who are facing challenges in life, we thought that it made good sense to examine the efficacy of problem-solving therapy to prevent depression in people beset with many of life's stressors in old age and already living with some degree of symptoms. Now, we needed a comparator. And this was a very, very interesting and I think difficult set of choices for us to make. We could have chosen treatment as usual, which essentially is no treatment at all. In a sense, it's an internal control for the passage of time, if you will. We decided, however, that it would be more interesting and probably more acceptable and enabling of us to recruit Black people if we had an active comparator that was culturally appealing and that made sense to both Black and white older adults. So we chose education or coaching in healthy dietary practices. Why did we do that? Well, because issues of diet and overweight are of concern to many Black people. We had the benefit of a survey that had been conducted by the University Center for Social and Urban Research, Rich Schultz, director, which showed that rates of both stress and concurrent obesity were very high among Black respondents to the UC-SUR survey. So after consultation with our Community Research Advisory Board, who endorsed education and healthy dietary practices coaching, we chose that as our active comparator. We decided not to include an internal control in the form of treatment as usual. The CRAB were concerned that that actually might be a barrier to recruitment of, particularly of Black participants. What did we find? Well, once participants came into the trial, they stayed in the trial for 2 years. This was the longest depression prevention trial, and one of the few in older adults, and the only one, to my knowledge, involving a substantial number of Black participants. And what we found was the following. Bear in mind that our archival data, as well as other data in the literature, suggested that the incidence of major depression in people like this would be on the order of 20 to 25% over 2 years. Okay. What we found was an incidence of 8.5%. 8.5% over 2 years among the participants in the trial. Guess what? The incidence was identical in Black and white participants. There was no difference in the incidence, despite the fact that our Black participants had substantially greater burden of risk for depression. The incidence was the same. And when we look continuously at measures of depressive symptom burden, not just the incidence of episodes, but the overall trajectory of depression symptom burdens, identical in both interventions, identical in Blacks and whites. A remarkable finding. We also examined other outcomes: anxiety, health-related quality of life, body mass index, etc. And again, the patterns were very similar in both interventions: coaching and healthy dietary practices, and problem-solving therapy. If we have a minute now, I'd like to take a moment and read you briefly a case vignette from a Black participant who was in the trial and who had been randomly assigned to the diet condition, education and healthy dietary practices. The reason I want to do this with your indulgence is that it will give you, I think, a more concrete feeling for what a participant's experience was like in the clinical trial. And this lady illustrates many of the challenges that our Black participants have. So with your indulgence, I'm going to take about 3 minutes to read you a brief vignette. This is a 71-year-old Black widowed woman whose baseline score on the CESD, a measure of emotional distress, was elevated at 24. She had had chronic mild depression, what we would call dysthymia in mental health. She also had suffered chronic lymphoid leukemia, and the onset of her mild depression had coincided with the diagnosis of chronic lymphoid leukemia several years before she entered the trial. She reported a conflicted relationship with her adult son, a user of crack cocaine, who lives with her along with his girlfriend. As I mentioned, she was randomized to education and coaching in healthy dietary practices. Interpersonal issues were discussed during the intervention only as they related to her eating habits and healthy nutrition. At the first session, her eating patterns, a review of her eating patterns revealed that she typically consumed foods containing high fat and simple carbohydrates and had gained 22 pounds over the last 2 years. After she was oriented to the structure and the principles of the diet intervention, this was followed up by 6 brief sessions with her health coach, in this case Mike Lakovich, who was one of the interventionists working in our clinic. A guiding principle of diet was that older adults need high nutrition content with fewer calories, as illustrated by the modified My Pyramid for older adults, in which vertical triangles of varying size indicate the importance of food groups in specific proportions. Mike worked with her to inculcate mindfulness, daily mindfulness about the type and quantities of food that she was consuming. She also utilized an instrument called Rate Your Plate, which is a diary measure designed to help people monitor their own nutrition. Her primary goals, which she endorsed and came up with herself, were to increase the frequency of home cooking, to improve the quality of her food, to reduce snacking, and to reduce reliance on the protein shakes which her physician had recommended. She was also given a copy of the NIH pamphlet, Heart Healthy Cooking, African American Style, which she found very helpful. So she continued to participate in the diet program. She had several follow-up interventions with Mike over the 2 years, and despite recurrence of her chronic lymphoid leukemia midway through the protocol with us, her depression scores continued to decrease, and her body mass index also decreased over the course of the 2 years in the trial. I wanted to give you a sense for her individual experience, which I think is typical of that of many Black participants in the trial. So, let me finish up then over the next couple of minutes and talk a little bit about the implications of the trial and where we're trying to go from here in our research program. So this is a potentially scalable intervention because of its simplicity. What I neglected to tell you was that the average face-to-face time of participants with their interventionists in the trial, the average cumulative face-to-face time over 2 years was on the order of 6 hours. 6 hours over 2 years. Very, very brief, but focused types of intervention. As well, there's good reason to think that interventions like this might be amenable to delivery by lay health counselors. There's a great interest, particularly in low and middle income countries, but also in this country as well. Can peer educators, people who look like persons in the population of interest, can peer educators, lay health counselors, become effective deliverers of simple but useful mental health interventions which might serve both preventive and treatment purposes. We have since gone on with Stuart Anderson and other colleagues to propose a depression intervention prevention development study to be carried out with colleagues in Goa, India, again reflecting my interest in global mental health issues. We were fortunate to receive a fundable priority score of 20, and now if the bureaucracies in India and the bureaucracies at NIH can have a meeting of the minds, we may actually be funded before I die. This may take some time, but at least we're hopeful about it. Let me tell you, though, by way of finishing, how the study that you've heard about today breaks new ground. Again, focus on underserved people who are particularly vulnerable to issues of depression, the 2-year follow-up, and an active control that allows people to focus on an aspect of their health that they are concerned about. Other interventions that we are currently testing in our ongoing work here at Pitt, in addition to problem-solving therapy, we have an interest in testing whether teaching people better sleep habits in the form of brief behavioral interventions for insomnia may help to protect them from the development of common mental disorders like depression and anxiety. We're also looking at the effects of exercise. Again, what's good for the heart is good for the brain and may have a protective effect. The final area that we are looking at carefully is whether we can incorporate biosignatures into our depression prevention work. We know that about 20 to 25% of people living with mild depression will go ahead to full syndromal depression. But that leaves 70 or 80% who don't, who are resilient. Can we use simple biosignatures, blood draws, inflammatory cytokines to identify people at particularly high risk so that we can focus simple interventions like diet, like problem-solving therapy, on those whose biomarkers suggest that there may be an indicated increased risk for developing depression. The other interest that we have, that my colleague Bruce Rollman is, I think, pursuing with great vigor here in the School of Medicine, is the use of internet-based strategies, internet-based support groups, for example, to provide interventions for people in primary care settings living with common mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. This is a brave new frontier, and one that may indeed have immense salience as we try to reach out to populations that are underserved, whether here at home or across the globe in low and middle income countries. So we have a few minutes if you have comments or questions on any aspect of this. Mario, we can spend a few minutes. Okay, thank you. Only one of you fell asleep, so that's great. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Roth.
Chip, recently I've seen some abstracts about the issue of depression and social support and the importance of social support, which can be defined in different ways. But I wonder, in terms of the people you looked at, in either arm, so to speak, was there any difference in marital status or single or living with other people? It's just an area that struck me when I saw these abstracts as probably correct.
Well, I think that's right, Lauren. And in fact, a larger proportion of our black participants were living alone, either no longer married, widowed, or divorced, as compared with the white participants. Both groups, whites and blacks, endorsed moderate levels of social support. But to your broader point, there's been a spate of articles recently on the adverse health effects of loneliness. You may have seen some of these articles, one of which appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences relatively recently, addressing the adverse effects of loneliness, both for heart health and brain health. It's a remarkable finding. What is difficult, though, for me to be sure about, Lauren, is the extent to which the studies of the adverse effects of loneliness control for concurrent levels of depression. As you well know, depression and loneliness go hand in hand. Many of the adverse health consequences of loneliness are identical to what have already been documented in the literature with respect to depression. Early mortality, greater rates of dementia. So it's not clear to me whether you can convincingly disambiguate the effects of depression and loneliness, but your point's a very, very important one in terms of intervention. I think that one of the reasons that both of our interventions probably were helpful is that they involve more or less regular contact with helpful interventions. Although the total amount of face-to-face contact was by no means great over a 2-year period. But people, I think, got the sense of empowerment that they could work on problems that were important to them. They didn't have to continue feeling overwhelmed or helpless. And I think that sense of learning new skills increased their resilience in the face of the stressors that they were living with. That's my sense about what was happening here. Other comments or questions? Yes?
The dietary tracking that participants used, was it a written journal or were they using electronic tracking?
So the dietary tracking that people used was a written journal, it was a diary, yeah. It's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
I might have missed this, but did your study include salaries or incomes?
Yes, thank you.
So what I'm trying to ask is, do
Yes.
you find that people of a lower economic group have more depression than people in the middle class or people who are more advantaged?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We used census tract data to estimate the household incomes of the participants. The median household income of the black participants was on the order of $20,000 to $24,000, and of the white participants in the high 40s. So there was a very substantial difference in census tract-based estimates of median household income. Despite that, and this is part of the greater burden of risk for depression that I think was present among our black participants, despite that, their overall response, the patterns of their response to the two interventions were essentially identical to that of the white participants. Having said that, however, we previously reported that there is indeed a socioeconomic gradient in the pattern of treatment response. If you already have clinical depression and if you are poor, despite the fact that you may be getting good evidence-based treatment, it may take you longer to get well if you are poor, and you may experience greater persistence, greater duration of suicidal ideation as part of your depression. So this is an interesting difference in a sense between the prevention that we just did in our earlier treatment work. Yes, big socioeconomic differences, but apparently that didn't represent a barrier to adequate prevention of depressive episodes.
And some of that might have to do with the location that you mentioned in the east, Petra's, the church. Kingsley House is right next door to Mount Ararat, so these people might have a religious background, which certainly gives them a whole lot more hope.
I think many did, actually. And I think people who have thought about why are rates of suicide so low among older black women have often invoked affiliation with communities of faith as one of the reasons that may be protective. So I think that your comment is right on point. Thank you. Well, folks, let me thank you for coming today and for continuing the conversation. It's great to see you. And Mario, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming.
And our salutations to our colleagues at the University of Maryland, Stephen Thomas and Sandra Krause-Quinn, and colleagues at